Hello, and welcome to Engage with Eagle Forum, a podcast to encourage the modern day woman in her vital role in shaping society. I'm one of your hosts, Kirsten Hasler, and I'm the Executive Director of Eagle Forum. Today, I'm joined by my friend, an Eagle Forum board member, Glyn McKay.
Hello.
Today, we have with us Dr. Aaron Brewer. Dr. Brewer grew up in Salt Lake City and earned a bachelor's degree in communication and cognitive science from Hampshire College in Massachusetts. She went on to earn a master's degree and PhD at Utah State University in instructional technology and learning science. Dr. Brewer has a very powerful story. She developed gender dysphoria in first grade and is now an advocate against the harms of the transgender movement. She is a wife and mother of two and lives in Utah. Erin, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited that you're covering this important issue.
Well, there are so many issues that we could address regarding the transgender movement. You know, we're seeing everything from lawsuits between divorced parents who disagree over their child's sex to disagreements over sports competitions because you've got biological females forced to compete against biological males. But we just want to focus this episode on the basics and what you've learned from your experiences. So will you just start from the beginning and tell us what you went through as a child who struggled with her identity?
Sure. And I want to point out that this is something I never thought that I would talk publicly about. And the only reason that I decided to is because I started seeing what was happening with the transgender movement. And it bothered me so much that I felt almost an obligation to share my experience. So when I was in kindergarten, I was a perfectly content little kid, didn't have any kind of gender dysphoria. And then between first in kindergarten and first grade, I was pretty brutally sexually assaulted. And I can look back now and recognize what happened, but at the time I didn't realize that I developed what they would now call a trans identity, as a way to protect myself, because in my little girl brain, I thought that the reason I had been sexually assaulted was because I was a girl, and if I was a boy, that it wouldn't happen. And so I started back to school in first grade, insisting that I was a boy and doing everything that I could to convince my teachers and my classmates and my parents and pretty much anybody around me that I was a boy. And I became really aggressive, both verbally and physically, because I was trying to model what I thought a boy was. So it was sort of like I was looking at the boys and trying to do what they did, only more so, because I figured if I did it well enough, then everybody would say, oh, she's a boy, and would accept me as a boy. And thankfully, I lived in a time where people understood biological reality, and none of my teachers, none of my classmates, my parents didn't say, oh, she must be born in the wrong body and really a boy, because that's what's happening to children now. Instead, my teacher referred me to the school psychologist, who met with me and sort of did an assessment. And at the time, I was so filled with shame and guilt and disgust about the sexual assault that I didn't mention it. I was, part of me had decided, like, Erin, who was sexually assaulted, I'm not her anymore. I'm now this boy who's not vulnerable. And so when I talked to the school psychologist, I talked as if Erin, that little girl, was actually not me. And I didn't really accept her as being me. And so even though my mom and my brother and my stepdad knew about the sexual assault, I didn't bring it up when I met with the school psychologist. I just kept saying, I'm a boy. I'm a boy. I want you to treat me like a boy. I just want you to let me be a boy. And she recognized that as a mental health issue, and wrote up a plan to help my parents and my teachers help me to accept myself as a girl. And I'm so thankful for that, because I can't imagine if I had grown up today and the therapist had said, oh, you must actually a boy. Let's go ahead and call you by Timothy, which was the name I wanted to be called. You can go ahead and use the boys' bathroom. We'll dress you like a boy and use boy pronouns. Because if that had happened, then as I got older and I continued in therapy, I never would have gotten a chance to address the sexual assault that happened in the first place.
Yeah.
That would have just been buried. And that the sexual assault had such a profound impact on me that I am thankful that I got the chance to work it through in therapy, work through some of that trauma, and to find a way to accept myself as a girl, and to realize that insisting I was a boy was an unhealthy coping mechanism, and that there were ways that I could keep myself safe even though I was a girl, and that it was okay to be a girl, and there wasn't anything shameful or disgusting about it, which is kind of what I thought. And the other thing is that I had such incredible self-hatred when I was impersonating a boy, and especially towards my genitals, because I felt like they were what betrayed me. And so there were times when I would just get in sort of a rage, and I would take a rock and just pound my genitals until they bled, because I was so angry. And the new trans movement would say that self-hatred is okay and a normal developmental path, instead of saying, whoa, that kind of self-harm indicates a serious mental health issue that needs to be dealt with.
And it's just so hard for any child to have to go through. And until recently, you were actually a lifelong Democrat, a delegate for Bernie Sanders in the 2016 election, a donor to LGBTQ organizations, and now you're not. So what changed?
Yeah, it's a huge transformation, and it's so funny on Facebook. You know, a year ago today or 4 years ago today will pop up, and you'll see the post that you made, you know, a couple years ago, and I just look at it and I'm like, whoa, it's so different. And so I was very much invested as a leftist, a liberal, a Democrat my whole life, very committed to that identity, I guess, to defining myself in that way and to those causes. And like you said, I donated to the local LGBT organization, Equality Utah. And that's actually what ended up facilitating my About Face. I guess it was about a year and a half ago, I got an email, or I got a letter in the mail from Equality Utah. And the letter was talking about a new initiative that they were going to start to stop conversion therapy here in Utah, to ban what they called conversion therapy. When I first started reading it, I thought, oh yeah, conversion therapy, we definitely should ban that. I'm so glad they're doing this. But then as I read further down the letter, I just got this sinking feeling as I realized that what they were going to ban was the very therapy that helped me resolve my trans identity when I was a little girl. And I read it a couple of times. I thought, that can't be right. And so I tried to contact the director of Equality Utah and raise some questions, and he actually blocked me. So I was trying to connect with him on Facebook, and he blocked me, and I was like, what? And so I decided to go to an event that Equality Utah was holding, to see if I could talk to him personally, because I kept thinking, I must not be getting this. There must be something I'm not understanding here. So I went to an event at the public library, and he had security remove me. And I thought, what's going on here? What is happening here? And I can't remember, it was around the same time that I decided that I was going to testify at the state legislature about my experience, because I felt like people must just not be understanding. They must just be confused. And if I shared my story, that the other side would say, oh, okay, we've got this wrong.
Right.
And the way they've done this, the way they've defined conversion therapy, for people who don't know, most people think of conversion therapy as something like electroshock therapy, or lobotomy, sometimes beatings, doing horrible things to people to try to get them to not be gay anymore.
Right.
Which actually we don't do anymore. It's already illegal to do those things to people. So we don't really have to worry about that. But what they're including now is that therapists have to affirm a person's sexual identity and sexual orientation and gender identity. So it's not conversion therapy, it's actually affirmative therapy. They're requiring therapists to do. So in my case, there are a couple of things that it impacted. And I forgot to tell you that when part of my trans identity when I was younger was to have girlfriends. because I thought, well, I'm a boy, I'm going to have a girlfriend. And so I cultivated these same-sex relationships and acted as if I were the boy in the relationships. And part of this conversion therapy ban would be to require a therapist to affirm that sexual orientation that I had as a child, even though I was just a little kid. I was way too young to be having sexual relationships. And so for them to have to affirm that when actually they should probably be saying, wait a minute, you're just a little kid. Why are you already involved in sexual relationships?
Right.
So that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is requiring therapists to affirm a child's transgender identity. And so my school psychologist couldn't have said, Erin thinks she's a boy, we need to work with her. That they would have to say, it turns out Erin is a boy, let's accommodate her as if she's a boy. And that's just incredibly damaging to kids. And so I went and testified, and what happened in Utah is they ended up changing the legislation so that it was really just targeting that really cruel kind of therapy that really doesn't happen anymore anyway. And Equality Utah ended up pulling the bill because they were so unhappy about how it had changed. And then the governor took addressed it's called DOPL, the Division of Licensing and Professional Services, I think. So it's basically the professional licensing board here in Utah, and had them enact the therapy ban. So they went around the legislative process in order to get this enacted, which I find really incredibly concerning.
Yeah.
And it's very concerning to me that these conversion therapy bans are being enacted, not just in the United States, but all over the world. And the United Nations actually, they have a special expert, they call him an expert on sexual orientation and gender identity. He has recently written a report where he's suggesting that something like a parent not affirming their child would be considered conversion therapy. Or if a teacher at school uses the wrong, the non-preferred pronouns of a child, that would be considered conversion therapy. And he compares it to like gang rape and electroshock therapy and starving someone to death. And so this whole movement is going to end up removing parental rights, and we already see it happening. As you mentioned, there's the case where there's a dad in Texas, Jeff Younger, who's trying to fight to prevent his ex-wife from medically transitioning his son. And there's a case in Canada, and actually the hearing is today, where a dad lost his parental authority to stop his 14-year-old daughter from getting testosterone. She is now getting testosterone. She's been on testosterone for over a year now. And now the dad is being charged with contempt of court for speaking out about his story. So this is an incredibly concerning movement. And for those who don't know what happens, once a child is affirmed socially, so in my case, told, yes, indeed, you're a boy, you can use the boys' locker room, you can dress like a boy, and we'll call you by the boy's name. Shortly thereafter, they tend to put them on puberty blockers. So as young as 8 years old, they'll put them on medication that basically arrests their development and keeps them in that childlike state, prevents them from going into puberty. So basically, they're inducing developmental delays in these kids. And then in some cases, they're immediately putting these kids on cross-sex hormones, which causes them infertility and a whole slew of other medical issues. And then there are cases as young as 13 where girls are getting their breasts amputated. And so what happens when you start affirming a child is, first of all, you tell them that the belief that they have about themselves, that they're inherently flawed, is accurate, that they should feel that way, that they should run away from themselves and assume this new identity, and that it's normal. And then you suppress their development, which is both physical and cognitive. And on top of that, you give them the opposite sex hormones that causes their body to start developing sex characteristics of the opposite sex, which if a child isn't already having some cognitive difficulties already, this is just going to compound any mental health issues they already have. And it's shocking to me that they would allow this to happen, that this can happen in the United States or anywhere.
Right, right. Well, and the irony is that in this whole national conversation, conservatives or simply those who would resist this kind of behavior and action are deemed the, violent ones or the, right. So, we want you to know we're really grateful for the sacrifices that you've personally made to talk about the real issues here. And we know it's taken bravery and courage, and you've gotten a lot of resistance and nasty pushback. So will you talk to our listeners about that? What has it been like to speak out?
Yeah, I had no idea. One of the reasons I always thought of myself as a liberal was because I care about children. And so I assumed that when people found out about this, when people on the left found out about this, they would automatically try to stop it. They would say, of course, this is horrible. But instead, I found that I was completely rejected by friends and family. I was threatened. There were people who said that they were going to try and get me kicked out of my housing. They were going to try and get me fired. There were people who were making physical threats against me, which I've never experienced anything quite like that. I actually had the mother of a local trans activist send me email and contact information for her son because she was worried about my safety and she wanted me to contact the police. I have been told by local activists that they violently hate me. And one day my 15-year-old son came home from school. He had been waiting at a bus stop and someone came up to him and said, a lot of us want to kill your mom.
Oh my gosh.
So this is really serious kind of intimidation that happens. And I had no idea. Again, another reason why I always assumed sort of affiliated as a liberal is that wanting to respect other people's beliefs and feeling like it's really important for lots of people to have their stories told. And as I've come out and talking about this more and more, I've found that my whole understanding of the liberal party, the leftist, the Democratic Party was completely wrong. That this is not the party of tolerance. It is not the party of acceptance. They don't care about children. They don't care about women. They don't care about the marginalized and minorities. They have a very clear agenda, which is undermining parental authority and really doing damage to kids. And it's like my entire foundation crumbled when I started to realize that my understanding of the ideology I had always thought I believed was completely wrong. It was really quite, it just sucked the wind out of me. And I still just wonder how was I so wrong all these years? How was I so completely deceived? And it's really been kind of a sense of reckoning, because I used to volunteer for Planned Parenthood. I used to donate to them. I used to support these organizations, and their whole goal is really to sexualize and objectify children, to undermine parental authority, to split apart families. And it's been really sobering the more I recognize how I was a part of that.
Why do you think that is? I mean, I can't imagine that it's a bunch of, that these people, individuals, these leftists sit around and think, oh, we're going to, destroy children. What is it that motivates them? What do you think?
I have a couple of theories. One is I really think that this is a push towards Marxism. And if you can split apart families, then it's easier to impose something like Marxism. In Marxism, each person is the same. There's not the sanctity of the family. And so I think that that's part of the motivation. I really think that there's a motivation by pedophiliacs who are trying to normalize pedophilia. And I really hate to think this because it sounds really conspiracy theorist, but I really think part of it is a movement towards promoting pedophilia, the acceptance of, they call it minor attracted persons or MAPS as a sexual orientation. And we now have protections. This whole therapy ban actually requires therapists to accept a person's sexual orientation. And we have legislation that requires businesses to accept people's sexual orientation. So if they can convince enough people that being a pedophiliac, a minor attracted person, is a sexual orientation, then that person actually is protected that because of their sexual orientation, which is horrifying to me. And I think part of this started with birth control pills, and I never made the connection before. When I was young, I was sexually active at a very early age. I went into Planned Parenthood between the ages of 13 and 14 and was able to get birth control pills without parental permission or consent or even knowledge. I was just able to go in and get those birth control pills. And it never even occurred to me at the time that taking them might not be a good idea, especially for a child who was still going through puberty. It never even occurred to me. But now I look back and I think, how on earth was it that I was able to access hormones that potentially could really cause damage to my body?
Right.
And now we're seeing that narrative pushed even further. So now we're seeing Planned Parenthood is now giving out cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers. And there's a push to lower, to make it so that children can access all kinds of medical treatments, abortion, birth control pills, cross-sex hormones, puberty blockers, vaccines without parental permission. And so if we can normalize the idea that children can do medical consent and don't need parents for that, then it's not that much further to normalize sexual consent. And when you look at what Planned Parenthood, the kind of lessons, the kind of materials they're pushing, and a lot of these LGBTQ organizations, it's all about normalizing sex. And we actually have, there's curricula in the school now that's promoting children to masturbate as early as kindergarten, and teaching them that sex is just another form of pleasure, and really disconnecting it from any kind of relationship. And so some people it's even hard for me to understand how I've changed so much, but it was sort of like when I started to realize the damage that the transgender narrative causes kids, and how harmful it is, and the fact that they're encouraging these kids to self-harm, basically. And then trying to connect it. Okay, so how did we get here? We got here from the LGBT movement, which said that sexual orientation is fixed and that you can't change that. And as I started to speak out about my experience, it occurred to me, wait a minute, according to them, I should be a lesbian now, and I'm not. And so there's something that's, there's a hole in that somewhere. That's not always the case. You're not necessarily born that way and can't change. And so from there, I started thinking about, wait a minute, why was I getting birth control pills when I was a little kid? Why was it that nobody at the Planned Parenthood clinic said, wait a minute, maybe you shouldn't be having sex? That's probably not a good idea. And so it's sort of like, there's just sort of been this every issue I look at it, it's like a new lens that I'm seeing it through. And it just is incredibly concerning to me that those on the left are so hostile towards someone like me that I don't know if you and your listeners are aware of what happened to J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter books. But she simply said that biology is real, and for that she's attacked. So they no longer are just suggesting that transgender rights should be respected. They're saying that it's possible for someone to be born in the wrong body, and that we have to accept somebody else's feelings rather than reality. And when you have a group of people who is able to convince people to discard reality and truth and to accept lies, they have complete control.
And our president, former president, Uni Smith, President Emeritus, she always says this whole movement, it's the ultimate rebellion against the creator.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I was an atheist for most of my life, and I actually was invited to speak at an Eagle Forum conference. And it's funny because I really kind of debated with myself whether or not to accept the invitation. Because when I was growing up, the Eagle Forum was one of the evils. in my home. My mom would scream at the TV when anybody from the Eagle Forum was on the news. I really was indoctrinated to believe that they were representing all the ills in society. So I sort of was, and I was kind of scared because I was like, here I am, this atheist, this liberal, kind of felt like going into a, hostile environment or something. I wasn't sure. I was really, really nervous. And I got there and I was welcomed so warmly and the people were so wonderful and I was accepted for who I am. And just, it was like, I found a family. It was the first time in my life where I just felt this incredible sense of belonging. And I was looking around at the people and thinking, I want to be like them. I want to be like them. They're smart, they're passionate, they're committed to taking care of children. But I thought, I can't be like them. I have so much, like, I'm dirty, I'm unlovable. God doesn't want my kind, is what I thought. And I came home after the conference and I was sitting on my bed and there were a few things that there were a few people at the conference who sat me down and just gave me little messages like, God loves you. And I'd be like, nah, he loves you. He doesn't love me. And they'd say, yes, he does. He loves you. And then during question answer period, one of Becky Gerritsen from Eagle Forum said something like, Erin, you may not believe in God, but I know he believes in you. And so I got home and I was just filled with this sense of, they're right. They are right. I know they're right. They have the truth. And so I had this debate going. I felt like I had, sort of my childhood self saying, they're the bad guys. They're going to reject you. They don't care about people. And then I felt like God was really speaking to me saying, come to me, come join us, come be part of this family. You're welcome. Yes. And I made the decision to become a Christian. I reached out and I said, Jesus, will you please save me? Will you please accept me? And it was a really, I just felt this sense of acceptance and love and warmth that I had never felt before. And I realized that all my life I had had so many troubles. I had there were so many things in my life that didn't go well, that I got into trouble, that I got in bad relationships. At one point in high school, I was prostituting. I made pornography. And I know now that if I had had God in my life and I had been following the Bible, that I wouldn't have made all those mistakes. I would have had some foundation. Yeah. And I probably wouldn't have even had gender dysphoria when I was a kid. I wouldn't have assumed that there was something wrong with me when that sexual assault happened. I would have reached out to God for comfort and support. And I would have had a community to help me work through my trauma. And I'm kind of emotional now, but it's in a good way because I realize now that I do have a family, and that you asked a little bit about how difficult it's been speaking out about these issues. And as hard as it is, getting threats and knowing that there are people who have really bad intentions towards you, I just feel completely safe because I know whatever happens that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. Yeah. And I almost have a sense of, it's not that I'm glad that the sexual assault happened and that I went through all that difficulty, but now I understand that maybe there was a purpose. Mm-hmm. And if I can use that to help others, then that makes me feel like everything was worthwhile. And I just pray every morning asking God to guide me and to allow me to speak to people so that they can understand that this trans ideology, it's not about tolerance, it's not about love, it's not about acceptance. It's really about control and undermining our families and ultimately undermining our government. And as you said, undermining God.
Yeah. Well, I just appreciate you sharing that. And you're exactly right that God is not the giver or the doer of the bad things in our lives, but he is the redeemer, and he can take all of those things and work them for our good and ultimately for his glory. And so we're just humbled to hear your story and just so thankful for what you're doing and how you're allowing him to use you in this space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't think there was a dry eye last year at the council. I vividly remember Becky standing
Yes.
up and telling you,
Same.
God is doing things through you, which it's so cool to be a witness of.
Yes.
Yeah, and it really is. I honestly I had well, and I think back about it because I used to say I don't believe in God. I
Mm-hmm.
would tell people, I don't believe in God. I'm an atheist. I don't believe in that. But I realized after my conversion that I actually did believe in God, and I was really, really angry at God
Yeah.
because I didn't understand why He let that happen to me when I was a little girl. I mean, that
Right.
should never happen to anybody,
Exactly.
and I blamed God for that. And I think a lot of people blame God when something really bad
Yes.
happens. And what I realized is that it's the evil that allows that to happen. And when you reject God, you just give more power to that evil. And that has been a huge realization for me. And I sort of have this sense of that little girl in me that was so damaged, just being held by God right now.
Yes.
It's a sweet,
Sorry.
sweet picture to think
Yeah.
about. Okay, so we're going to shift gears a little bit now. Total 360. But let's talk about some of the specifics of
Mm.
the terminology and what actually is happening so that our listeners know when they encounter these terms what's going on here. All right.
Yeah.
So when it comes to terminology, what is the difference between gender and sex?
That is a really good question. And I actually interviewed Ken Zucker, who is one of the sort of world experts on gender, and asked him that. And there really isn't a definition. I think gender is just a term that is used to somehow empower this idea of somebody being able to be born in the wrong body. What the trans activists will say initially is that sex is the chromosomes, the DNA, and gender is how you feel, whether you feel as if you're a male or female. However, they say that, but then they say things like, if a boy believes he's a girl, his penis is actually a female penis. Or um, if I believe that I'm a boy, then I should be able to get my birth certificate changed to reflect my sex as being male. And so I really think it's used as almost like a kind of double speak, a way to confuse people so that they don't understand what's going on, so that they think, oh, well, if somebody feels that way, we should probably be nice to them because that must be really hard. Instead of saying, what does that even mean? Because when the trans activists talk about gender, they suggest that the really kind of regressive stereotypes of male and female are what define male and female. So according to their standards, I still would be considered a male because in a lot of ways I don't ascribe to those stereotypes at all. And most of us don't. There are very few people who 100% feel that, Barbie doll feminine, which I find really offensive, to suggest that like being a female means you're a Barbie doll and
Right.
being male means that you're like G.I. Joe, that those are the two extremes. And what they say is that most people are like somewhere in between. So they're gender non-conforming or they're gender fluid. And so they're using these terms, I think, just to confuse people and to try and exert control over them. Because if you can convince people that somebody is assigned a sex rather than born a sex, then you've basically just convinced them of a lie. And again, we talked about how powerful lies are. So I think that they're just using this term gender. I mean, originally gender was used to define whether or not like pronouns are gendered, he, she, gendered pronouns. In a lot of the Romance languages, there are words that are gendered that have, for whatever reason, they have a male or a female ending.
Mhm.
But in reality, I don't think gender has any meaning. Really.
Yeah.
We basically were born either male or female, and that's kind of the biological reality of it.
Right.
Mhm. So the American Psychiatric Association defines gender dysphoria as involving a conflict between a person's physical or assigned gender and the gender with which they identify. So what does that mean?
That is a great question. And if you look further into the definition, again, they use these very kind of old-fashioned ideas about what it means to be a girl or a boy. So if you have a girl who's playing with trucks and who likes to play with the boys, who's a typical tomboy, that could now be considered a transgender girl because she is not adhering to the gender stereotypes and for a psychological manual to suggest this is really concerning. And so one of the things that I want to emphasize is that gender dysphoria, I think I actually, the term used to be gender identity disorder. And I think that is a reasonable diagnosis. In my case, that made sense because I had all this self-hatred and I was trying to act differently and, do everything I can to not be a girl. And that's a problem. When you have someone who hates themselves so much that they want to be something different, that is a psychological issue that needs to be addressed. So it's good that they had that as an identity issue. But gender dysphoria it really makes no sense because anybody who's had kids knows that boys and girls don't conform to these incredibly restrictive ideas of what
Yeah.
it means to be male and female.
Right.
Mm-hmm. That's so true.
I even read a statistic, I think, that said something like 98% of children who struggle with their sex as a boy or a girl actually come to accept their sex by adulthood.
Well, and
So,
that's really important. Yeah, that's actually research uniformly shows that the vast majority of kids who have gender dysphoria or gender identity issues or gender confusion will grow up and resolve that naturally. It's actually quite normal to have those feelings. Maybe not quite to the extent that I did, but it's really normal for kids to kind of go through these feelings. If you have a boy who suddenly is really interested maybe in flowers, that boy might have the sense of like, oh, I wish I was a girl because then I could have flowers in my room and nobody would think that was funny. Or if you have a girl who really wants to play in the mud and get dirty, she could be like, oh, I wish I were a boy. That would make my life so much easier. So those kind of thoughts are really, really normal for children. But and again, going through adolescence is often a cure for that kind of dysphoria because the hormones kick in, our bodies change, and the vast majority of people grow up and accept themselves for what they are. And part of that is just that cognitive development and emotional development where you no longer have that kind of magical thinking that you can become something you're not. There are very few adults who want to, who insist that they're a cat or who say that they're a firefighter, and yet kids do stuff like that all the time. And so part of it is just that emotional development of realizing that reality matters.
right. Well, and I think it's something that we all need to pay attention to in our world. I have a very masculine, very attractive husband who just doesn't happen to enjoy sports and he's got a gorgeous voice and he sings. And I actually had someone that I loved and trusted, a mentor in my life, when we started dating, who said, are you sure he's not gay?
Oh.
And I thought, are you kidding me? And that is a conservative Christian in the church. So I think we all need to be careful about the things that we're imposing on our children and on the people around us about these, very restrictive identities, I guess, that we give each other. You're either born a male or you're born a female, and the rest is up to how God created you, right?
And I also feel like there's really an attack on sex roles. And so, we talk about gender, but there's also sex roles. And I think that feminism has really attacked sex roles. And because of technology, we're not as confined to the roles as we used to be. It used to be really difficult for a male to be a single dad because he doesn't have, he wasn't able to birth a baby. He wasn't able to nurse a baby. Now we have, some blurring of these roles. But I think that I know that I got the message from my liberal mom, who is part of the National Organization of Women, that the best way to be a woman was to be a man. That really we're going to define successful women by what is a successful man.
Yeah.
And I think that that's done a lot of damage to women because it's taught them that, being a mother, being a wife, volunteering at the schools, all those things aren't important. And what's important is to get that traditional success that men used to have, that was sort of what men strived for. And I think it's done a lot of damage to our society because little girls get the message that if they have those inclinations to want to be a wife and a mother and do more traditional sex roles, that's not acceptable, that there's something wrong with them and that they're not successful. And I think that we need to reclaim that. And, feminism said that men and women are the same. We just have different bodies. And I think that it's okay to say we're different. And that difference is what we should celebrate rather than deny.
Right. Right. I think it's really important to look at past generations and at a little bit of history. This isn't transgender issues activism. That's not new. And you were on an excellent panel at our last Eagle Council in January where you spoke with two others who had had similar childhood experiences. And you mentioned the different reactions over the generations when it comes to a child who is experiencing gender identity issues. So can you just summarize that for us and how your experience was different and how we should be considering this in this current generation?
Sure. It was actually fascinating because it was a panel, I was on it, and Walt Heyer, who was a transsexual, and Lynn Meeker, whose children have become transgender. And so Walt is probably the generation or two before me. And he grew up at a time when I believe it was John Money and I think it was Stanley Bieber. There was this movement, and it came out of Kinsey's research that that you should go ahead and perform sex change operations on people with gender dysphoria. So Walt went through a full sex change operation and realized it didn't help. So he had this incredible, horrible surgery. Right afterwards, he thought, oh, this is wonderful. This is great. But a couple of years later, he realized it was a huge mistake and it didn't actually solve his problems. And so, and he was at a time where there were a number of people who went through these full sex change operations, and the research showed that it didn't help. And so these clinics shut down and they stopped doing these kinds of surgeries, and they stopped suggesting that that was the appropriate treatment. So then my generation came along, and thankfully they recognized my issue as something that needed to be addressed. And rather than encouraging me to transition and say that I was a boy, the school psychologist came up with just a couple of really simple things like, let's get her in Bluebirds or Brownies, which are groups for girls, so that she's around girls more. Let's show her role models of strong women. Let's encourage her to, they actually put me in a group of kids who had communication difficulties because, I had so much anger and I wasn't able to express it. And so teaching me how to communicate better. And, all those really simple things were really helpful. And then I went on to get therapy that helped me to identify, this cognitive dissonance that I was having, and helped me to accept myself as a girl, helped me to kind of, I wouldn't say resolve the trauma, but to understand how much it had impacted my life.
Right.
And then you have Lynn, who is this generation's and her children. And this generation now is told that if you feel like you were born in the wrong body, you are born in the wrong body. If you even have any sense that you're not the sex that you are, then you're right. So it's basically taking somebody's feelings and putting them as the most important thing, putting them over reality or fact. And so her kids have actually fully transitioned. And one of the things that she talks about that I think is just incredibly heartbreaking, and I hear this from a number of moms, that when a child starts on hormone therapy, a girl child starts on hormone therapy, her voice changes forever. And Lynn talks about the fact that she'll never hear her daughter's voice again. And in some ways, it's like the death of a child, because the child, is completely changed. Talking about Rob Hoogland's case, the man up in Canada whose daughter was put on testosterone at the age of 14, her voice will always now be deep. And he actually told me that when he calls to talk to his kids, he's got a son and a daughter, he doesn't know which child it is when they answer the phone, because her voice is permanently changed. She's growing facial hair now, and now is at risk for heart disease and other very significant health issues as a result of being put on these medications. And so it just strikes me that we sort of had this one generation that dealt with it by surgery, and then they realized that was a mistake. And then my generation, I was sort of in that period where they realized that this was a mental health issue. And then we're back to thinking that we should go ahead and encourage children to transition. So I think part of it is that there are cycles that we have, in mental. I have a lot of. I'm actually to the point where I don't encourage people to go to therapy at all, because I'm so disgusted with the American Psychological Association and the stories that I'm hearing. This is a little bit off topic, but there are so many parents who have taken their children who are having some kind of dysphoria, who are having some kind of depression or anxiety about their sex. And that therapist has completely affirmed that child. And the child is now starting medical treatments to transition. And the parent just says, I should never have taken my child to therapy, because this is what happens. And so therapists are no longer acting in the best interests of children. And that's important for people to know. And I'm hoping that this will stop. I know that there's legislative efforts now in place to try and stop doctors from giving this transgender treatment to children. And I'm hoping that those will pass, and that we'll get through this without too many children being damaged.
Yeah.
But I am concerned by how entrenched it is now in society, that we have teachers who are undermining parents' authority and allowing kids to transition at school without their parents knowing it, that we have doctors who are willing to give these medical interventions without parental consent, that we even have clinics in schools now that allow access to this kind of intervention. And this, we basically have a whole generation of children that's going to be damaged by this ideology. And I sure hope that we'll come back from it, but it's hard to imagine a pathway out of it when I see how much control and how deeply ingrained this is now, and how quickly it happened. This is something that, it wasn't even on my radar until a year and a half ago. And now it's so entrenched that people are fine with the idea of someone getting their birth certificate changed. And even children now are getting their birth certificate changed. So you can have a child in, say, Florida, whose parents say they're transgender. The child may not even be transgender, and get that child's birth certificate changed as a little kid, like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old. They move somewhere, and that child then goes to school and as the opposite sex. And there's really nothing anybody can do about that, because the birth certificate says that child is the opposite sex. And so if you're a little girl and there's a boy in your restroom, there's nothing you can do about it in a lot of these cases. And if you're going on a school trip and are going to have overnight lodging, there's a chance that your chaperone might be the opposite sex and there's nothing you can do about it, or that you're going to share a room with the opposite sex and your parents won't even know about it because all of this is now covered up and protected in schools.
Well, on schools, you mentioned there was a group of parents that we highlighted in Wisconsin who sued their school district because they refused to change a policy that allowed the district to conceal all of this from parents. So how do parents find out what's going on in their schools, and how do they fight this?
Yeah, it's so insidious, and most parents have no idea that their child could be going to school as young as 5 years old, and the teacher might have a backpack under her desk with a change of clothes for that child, and be calling that child by a different name, allowing that child to go to the opposite sex restroom, and being called pronouns of the opposite sex. The parent has no idea this is happening, and to me that's so disturbing. So a couple of things. I tell parents to first of all, if they can, to homeschool. I really think we're at a point now where if you can homeschool, that's the best solution, because then you're able to shield your child from this ideology. Some parents don't feel like they can do that, and if they can't do that, I encourage them to be in the schools, to drop in the schools, to spend time at the schools, to get to know the teacher, to insist that you see the curriculum and not just the sex ed curriculum, because this now is being introduced in all kinds of areas, in math, even math, science, history. This ideology is being pushed. A lot of times it's being pushed in the library. We'll have all these books that introduce kids to these concepts. There are even schools now where kids as young as kindergarten have to say which pronouns they want to use. And so rather than the teacher calling a boy and a girl, the child now decides what pronouns they want to use as young as kindergarten. So really, you need to, if you're a parent, you need to be in the school, and not just sort of at a prescribed time where you're maybe helping with an activity, but drop in and spend time there and talk to your child, talk to your children's friends, talk to other parents. And I would really just suggest coordinating with other parents and forming a coalition so that there's somebody in the school all the time. There's a parent in the school keeping an eye on what's going on. Also, go to school board meetings. A lot happens at those board meetings and you have no idea because they don't publicize it. And I would also suggest people do a Freedom of Information request at their local school districts to get information about what the transgender policy is, so that you know what the policy is at your school.
Mm.
Very good.
Oh, thanks for those tips. Definitely, it's good to know where to at least start.
Oh, and the final thing, don't let your kid go to the school counselor, which just sounds horrible. But if your child is having some issues, find a pastor, find a family friend, find someone who you have confidence in to let them talk to. But the counselors at the schools now, by and large, have really bought into this ideology. So even if your child is just going in for maybe like a curriculum check, go with them. If your sure. Child, when your child is being scheduled for classes, go with them. And otherwise, don't let them go to that school counselor, because you have no idea what they might tell your child.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we know that not all schools, this isn't happening everywhere, and that there are some really good principals and teachers and counselors out there. But what you said is exactly right. Your involvement, your engagement with these individuals and authority over your children during the day, you have to know them and know what's going on.
Yeah, and it's hard, because even in schools where you have some counselors or principal or teachers who aren't buying into this, there's so much pressure now. Sure. And teachers are losing their jobs if they're not willing to enforce this ideology. So it's getting harder and harder to find schools where this isn't kind of taking over.
How do you recommend that our listeners talk to their children about these issues?
That is a really good question. I think that it's important for parents to talk to their children about this. I think if you pretend like it's not happening, it could backfire. I think being really honest with them and explaining to them that there are people out there that are trying to hurt them by trying to convince them of things that aren't true. I think that this is where having a really good foundation in religion helps, because you can teach them that God loves them the way they are. And there's, they're born male or female. And I think that that can be really helpful. And I also think that listening to how they talk, and if they start using the kind of language of the transgender movement to really get more involved, if they start saying things like, I'm more of a boy than a girl because I like doing this. Or if they say, well, most boys do this. Or, if they start having these kind of general thoughts about what makes a man, and a woman that are kind of seeming to be part of this ideology. And also watch their social media, because a lot of these kids are indoctrinated in social media. And I think sitting down with your child and maybe doing social media together would be really great. And it's interesting because at the same time, you don't want kids to be hyper focused on this, because really kids shouldn't be worrying about whether they're a boy or a girl. That shouldn't even be part of their concern as a child. And so if you have a child who's maybe not traditionally acting in male and female roles, to really embrace that. So for example, my son really liked cooking at an early age, and that's not something typically boys do, although I kind of think maybe they might, but but I really encouraged that. I didn't try and judge that. And I think that that's something that we need to be really cautious about, because I think one of you mentioned that if a boy is acting in a certain way, it was your husband was acting in a certain way, might be gay. And if kids start picking up on that, like, if I'm a feminine boy, my parents might think I'm gay. I think I'm just going to be transgender because that way they'll accept me, which is happening in some Christian homes. And so I think it's really important not to suggest to a child that they're gay or lesbian, because really children should not be sexual. And so if they are behaving in sexual ways, that means that either they've been indoctrinated somehow or maybe abused, and you need to work with that child and really talk to them and figure out what's going on.
Right. Well, before we wrap up, I know you've started a group called the Compassion Coalition. Can you talk about that?
Sure, and I am really excited about this. It was originally Becky Garrettson from Alabama put together an Alabama Compassion Coalition in order to bring together a whole bunch of organizations to support the legislation to stop these medical interventions for kids. And so I asked her if she'd mind if I made it go national, and she said, sure, that'd be great. And so it's actually international now. And it's the idea is that it's it's non-denominational, it's not religious, it's completely secular, and it's for people on all sides, all kinds. We have radical lesbian feminists, and we have Christian conservatives, and everything in between. And the idea is this is such an important issue that we need to work together to protect our kids. And it can be challenging because we have people with really different worldviews and really different ideologies. But I think that it's been really powerful to work together and to realize that, even though we might disagree about everything else, this is an issue that we agree on. And so if anybody's interested in joining the Compassion Coalition, we have a Facebook group, and we also have a blogger site. And the most recent thing we've done is to put together a declaration of support for legislation to ban these interventions. And we're trying to get as many signatures as we can so that when legislation is introduced next year, that we can show legislators, hey, we've got bipartisan support for this legislation. This is something that crosses party lines. This is about protecting our kids.
Well, it's a valuable resource. I joined a while back, and I learned something new every time somebody posts something. I mean, just information I didn't even know was out there, things that are happening that I had no idea outside of my little bubble that is happening. So thank you for starting that, and for the way that you're investing. Your story is powerful, and we see how God is using it in a truly world changing way. So thank you for sharing. We appreciate it.
Well, and thank you. I will always have a place in my heart for Eagle Forum, because um, it really was the love and the goodness of the people that I met there that changed my heart. And so I want to encourage people that you might have the hardest hearted liberal atheist that you could believe. And you might think there's no way that they will ever come to Christ. There's no way their heart will ever soften. And there is. And so I want to leave people with knowing that you can reach people like me just by reflecting God's love,
Yes.
by extending yourself to them and accepting them, and not accepting their behaviors necessarily, but letting them know that they are truly a valuable person. And also by showing that what you're doing is fighting for kids. And I think a lot of people have, they don't understand that some of these conservative organizations, their motivation is for health and safety of kids. And if you can really explain that to people, it will change their hearts.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We appreciate your time, and listeners, we appreciate your time. Don't forget to subscribe, share with your friends, and leave us a review. We'd also love to hear from you. We're on all of the major social media outlets and at engagewitheagleforum.com. From your house to the State House to the White House, this is Engage with Eagle Forum.